I'm Brian, and I'm going to talk about GraphQL, is what I'm going to talk about. Before I jump into this, I have a lot of slides, so I just want to get like a show of hands of what stuff I can skip. How many people use React? Okay, cool. How many people use a REST API? Okay, cool. And there was one more question that I'll probably ask in the middle of the talk that I forgot I was supposed to ask. All my slides, I have a lot of slides, and there are links in them. So there's going to be a lot of tools that I'm going to talk about with GraphQL. I highly recommend checking out disco.netlify.com. That's where my slides are hosted. I will also tweet it. My Twitter is on the bottom right, and I will probably tweet this out after the fact, as well as some follow-ups for some of the projects I'm talking about during. But before I jump straight into this, I just want to talk about something a little bit that's going to segue a little bit into this. Anybody heard of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five? All right, cool. It's a hip-hop crew, one of the original, back in the late 70s. These guys, they look like they're in the Village People, but they're not. It just happened to be that was the age. And when these guys came out, they were in the transition period of when everybody was going to discos and listening to disco. But they created this new form of singing and poetry, which was called hip-hop today. So you got the rapping. You guys like rap? I think that was the third question I was supposed to ask. You guys like rap? Okay, cool. Hopefully you like it. And what's cool about this is, so a year ago I watched I binged this entire series called The Get Down. And what's cool is that Grandmaster Flash, he's actually one of the producers. He's actually on this show. And it was actually around the time he came up and how crews got together. So you have like DJs, Beat Boys, and graffiti and all that stuff came around within that late 70s period and then throughout the 80s. Anybody seen The Get Down? Cool. Unfortunately, it was canceled, so you can catch the horrible season 2. I really, really loved the first season. I can't really speak for Jaden Smith's acting because I think it was really bad. But outside of that, I thought it was an awesome series. So I'm very saddened that this didn't get picked up. So I just want to mention real quick as well, at that same time where hip hop was coming up, and also punk rock and all that other stuff was coming up. There's a new wave of stuff coming out. Not new wave, yeah, it's a different genre. Disco, quote unquote, ended in 1979. There was a whole day, there's a podcast called Undone that they did an entire episode about how disco ended. And basically disco hit its influx period. And it only lasted for 2 years, but it hit its influx period and people got really tired of it very quickly. You guys are probably really confused by now. So React, you guys familiar with React? Yeah, you guys raise your hands. So React came around, and then there's this question where, is jQuery done? Because React's a new jQuery. And there's a lot of Medium posts about this. I don't think that jQuery is dead, spoiler. jQuery is not dead. I actually have a project at work that I have jQuery in, and we started the project a year ago. Super valid to use jQuery for some projects, and we do. So jQuery is not dead. Disco is not dead. It's here forever. I don't know. It actually is dead. So what I'm trying to get at is GraphQL. This whole talk's about GraphQL, but I wanted to kind of lead into that. There was actually a blog post that came out last week about GraphQL killing REST, and I have opinions about that. They might be obvious already, but we'll get to that. But what you guys are here for is how do I use GraphQL today, right? Is anybody using GraphQL? Oh, wow. Surprise, surprise. Anybody, out of those 3 people, is anybody using GraphQL in production? Okay, why is there more? Okay, anyway. So only 3 people using GraphQL, but 5 of you are using it in production. That's awesome. GraphQL is the best. It killed REST. So what I'm getting at is, so Grandmaster Flash, the really cool thing about this is that Grandmaster Flash built their entire empire of the rap hip-hop scene on disco beats and disco records. So a lot of the beats that came out of the early hip hop came from disco records and funk records. And the reason I bring that up is because I love Kanye West, and he did the very same thing. He actually had songs that he sampled disco songs as well. So you guys familiar with anybody know Kanye West? You guys familiar? Okay, I kind of heard the name. Through the Wire, 2003, this song came out. Kind of hit the scene before his actual album dropped out, or the College Dropout dropped. There's too many drops in one sentence. This song was really good because it's kind of the song was all about how he got in a car accident right before he was about to get big. And it was a really an emotional time for him because it was his his next chance to become a rapper as opposed to like a producer who was making beats for everybody else. And then he got in an accident. So he made a song about that. Awesome song, really touching. And he sampled Through the Fire by Shaka Khan. Anybody a Shaka Khan fan? I'll be honest, I never even heard of her until Through the Wire came out. And what's really cool about this is that Kanye, to this day, Kanye, Biggie Smalls, Puff Daddy, everybody is sampling old school records, and they're bringing what was old to relevant for today. So you guys are like, oh, disco, give it a rest already, right? Is that what you're thinking? Before I jump into the GraphQL stuff, I do have to talk about a little bit more REST, but before I move on to that, I want to talk about my favorite thing to talk about, which is myself. So that's me on Twitter. Again, I'm going to tweet out some follow-up for these projects there. That's what I look like on Twitter. That's what Kanye West looks like on Twitter, or what he used to. He actually deleted his Twitter account a couple months ago. I don't understand. I'm going to get my Yeezy. I also work at a company called Netlify. Netlify is, anybody ever use Netlify? Cool, so you have some people. Awesome. So Netlify is a Git-centric solution for the modern developer, which essentially means we host websites, but we host websites that are built around the Jamstack. So you have JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So these like front-end focused sites, but sites that aren't limited by running servers all the time. So if you aren't quite sure what I'm talking about Jamstack, this is what like a monolith looks like. You guys familiar with this at all? Did your mom buy this for you when you were a kid? Super awesome. My mom did it once, and she only made that mistake once. I actually prefer, outside of monoliths, I prefer separation of my concerns. So I'm really into like having my client and my API. So just for the record, this is pronounced GIF. I just wanted to point that out. I'm just kidding. So I have my client, and then I have my API, and I have a separation of concerns. So you guys get that so far? But what's really cool, what we did a year ago at Netlify, we converted our Angular app to React. And it only took just switching out the grape with the jam, or the strawberry jam, rather. So I ruined my pun, but anyway. So we were able to really spread the jam. And so that's what the Jamstack's all about, like being able to have that separation concern. So if something new comes out or some new hotness, that's great. FYI, I do have a podcast called Jamstack Radio if you want to learn about more of that. Highly recommend checking that out. I do have a podcast about 3 episodes about GraphQL, separate episodes that we happen to talk about GraphQL. So let's talk about REST real quick, and I'll get into GraphQL. So REST kind of sums it up with like, REST is just a lot of endpoints. We have a lot of endpoints that, and you guys all raise your hands, so I won't explain exactly what REST is, but it's just a lot of endpoints so we can retrieve data. So if I have an endpoint that has /user, what do you think sorry. Oh man, I don't know how to go backwards. Actually, I do. It's the first time I'm trying to use my phone today because I don't want to look at my screen like this the whole time. So anyway, here's a user endpoint. Here's user/repository. So imagine this is the GitHub API. What would you expect this to return? Repositories. But what sort of attributes do you think you're going to return from repositories? Who knows, right? Look at the documentation. I don't know if I'm going to get a name. I don't know if I'm going to get IDs. I don't know what I'm going to get. I have to go to the documentation. So again, going back to the structure of separating your server and your client, if I hit my user endpoint, I expect to get a user. If I hit a repository endpoint, I expect to get a repository. We have GitHub. And / notifications, what do you think you get from that? Notifications? You think so, but no, you don't get notifications because Kanye deleted his Twitter. No, I'm just kidding. You don't get notifications because you have to do /user/notifications. So how do you know what endpoints are available to you? You got to dig into documentation. And that becomes its whole system of, if anybody's ever joined a new team that had an existing architecture, it's an entire like rigmarole of actually trying to figure out what endpoints are available to you, what sort of data looks like. It's kind of painful. Well, no, it really is painful, especially if it's a long-standing API and it's gone through multiple versions. So this is like what the Netlify dashboard looks like. We host websites, so these are tons of sites that I'm a part of. With this, all my data comes from all the data you see highlighted comes from sites. So I have a sites endpoint. Super straightforward. That's great. But I also have not just that, but highlighted up in yellow that you can't see because I should have picked a different color. But up on the top two left, I kind of have highlighted users and teams. So that for that one page, I'm hitting 3 different endpoints in order to get all the data on the page. Super straightforward. We all do this. Totally fine. And then we have another screen where we have deploys. Also not highlighted, but up on the top screen, we have not only just deploys, but we have different tabs that have different endpoints that get hit for each other tab. So we have like admin data, HTTP, SSL stuff, notifications, split testing, all of that stuff has to hit different endpoints. So every time I go to a different screen, I have to have a different endpoint. Now, we're all pretty much familiar. You guys rose your hands. All my examples are going to be React. So if you guys all pretty much rose your hand for React, so I don't think I need to be concerned. But fetching API endpoints, totally straightforward. I like to use Axios, so I can just do axios.get to whatever URL endpoint, and I'm good. From that, I can set state in a React component, and which looks like that. And then I can, based on my component amount, I can actually populate my data store. That's like if you don't want to use Redux. I'm not going to talk about Redux. I think people talk about Redux enough. I assume you guys have heard of it, or at least watched a video, or watched a talk about Redux. So I'm just going to skip Redux completely. So what you guys came for is actually GraphQL. So what is GraphQL? Well, GraphQL is a schema-based language that defines how you structure your data and how you return your data from your API. It looks a lot like this. So essentially, I can have my client and my API, or so my client and my API separate, and I can have a proxy in between those two to have GraphQL. So that way I can access my data quite differently. So instead of actually going back to my dashboard or whatever site in my Netlify, I only hit one endpoint. That endpoint is GraphQL. And the question is like, how do you do that? How could you just hit one endpoint and get all your data? Well, it's because with GraphQL, the bread and butter is really you get to define the shape of your data. So whatever sort of data you're looking for, you use these things called queries, and you can return that data that returns most likely JSON. I'm not sure. I don't know anybody else not using JSON. I think that's the only thing that people normally return nowadays. Anybody using XML for their projects? OK, my assumptions are correct. All right. So I'm doing a query on the left. I shape my data. I name the query hello world. That's just my preference. I call back to whatever the hello object looks like. On the right, you see what it looks like. Everybody following along? So what's really cool, and what's not cool is that I skipped a slide, is that you get to sample data with GraphQL. What's also really cool is that I don't have a slide about this, but the documentation's in line. All the documentation comes from the GraphQL endpoint. So everything is written in line on your schema, and it's great. So GraphQL client interactions. I'm just going to go through these really quickly, but there's two main ones, and then there's an extra one that came out a couple months ago. And first one's queries. So as long as you know what a query is in GraphQL, and that's what I showed on the left of those screens, then that's how you retrieve your data, and that's what it looks like this. So the language, it kind of looks like JSON, kind of looks like objects, just has no semicolons or commas. And I have a project that I worked with a bootcamp student with, and it was basically tell you how many senators you want to return. Or the data was an API, and you could actually return all the senators. So we used that with GraphQL. And I get to say, oh, I just want the ID, the state, the phone, the email. And if I don't want email, I can leave it off. If I want something extra, I can add it. And I think Visual Studio Code has some auto-completion for you. So if you want to know what else is there, usually you get a list through like Merlin. And Graphical, which I'll talk about in a sec, also does the same thing. The second thing is mutations. So if you think of queries as GET request, think of mutations as POST request. So if you want to literally mutate your data, you would use it in a mutation. So if I want to sign up or create a new account, I would use a mutation. And it looks very similar. The only difference is that you have a keyword called mutation instead of query. And then for this specific example, I want to delete a senator. Is that possible? Can you delete senators? That'd be nice, right? You just pass that ID, and you just use the schema-defined language, which is the STL, to do that as well. One more thing is subscriptions. This is brand new, so if you guys know JavaScript, sockets, subscriptions being able to subscribe to your GraphQL endpoint. and you get live updating. So that is now out of preview, and it's actually part of the GraphQL spec. I do want to point out, too, that GraphQL came out as a spec. So when Facebook was using it for the couple years they were using it, they got to the point where they just needed extra open source help. They put it in the developer preview last year, probably in the early part of last year, and talked about it. And then back in August, it came out of developer preview. So now it's actually a legit thing, so you can use it in production. There's companies like New York Times is using it for sure. Condé Nast is using it. Shopify is using it as well. And I think Airbnb is also looking to build their own open source tooling around that as well. They don't talk about it yet because they're not done. But subscriptions, nothing's different than a query. You just change the keyword to subscription, and I can subscribe to all my senators. So if I happen to delete a senator, I would always know that the senator is happening as well. With mutations, you can also, I didn't point out, mutations, you can describe what data you want to return when you do a mutation. So if you delete a senator, I can say I want to return whatever that deleted senator is, or the name, the email, whatever, and throw it up in a nice little console.log or a notification on the top to say, okay, senator deleted, he gone, or she gone. Subscriptions too, if you want to find out more about subscriptions, I have a lot of slides, so I wasn't able to break down everything code-wise. This website, you can look at that, you can use it live. It has a subscription set up. It's made by the team from GraphQL. They also have it open source, so if you do want to see the code, all that's open source as well. So if you're just considering doing GraphQL and you want to see what it looks like. It's also a React app as well, so you guys all familiar with that. So you're probably wondering, okay, he just went through the whole intro, and I did go through the intro pretty quickly because there was a talk yesterday, if you want to watch the video, where they talked about ClojureScript, and they talked about GraphQL and React Native, but they kind of sandwiched it in, so it wasn't really clear that they were talking about GraphQL. So check that out for a little more intro as well. But what I want to talk about is how you get GraphQL into your client. So I started and I want to preface that I started a project to get GraphQL on Netlify. I haven't yet gotten to Netlify because I literally just finished it like last Friday, and I only started like a week ago. Well, actually, legitimately started it like a week and a half ago. So my implementation happened really quickly, and it was actually pretty straightforward. I put this in here to preface that GraphQL is not just a React thing. So GraphQL does implementations for Vue, Angular, et cetera, and then also the languages. So Go, Clojure. I was going to say Rust, but they don't have Rust yet. But almost every other language, like C# also has a GraphQL, either gem or plugin or something, or documentation to show how to do it. And what's cool about GraphQL is you can actually fetch it just normally. So if you just want to do fetch requests, a lot of GraphQL started this way. And if you look up on the top, I've got my auth, but then next I have my actual GraphQL query. So I just pass it into the template string, and then I pass that query into my regular Axios fetch. This is okay, like it works, but you don't really get much of all the benefits of GraphQL by just using it as a normal, like how you would use it in a REST. And then same thing, everything's the same. I can just fetch it, component mount. I could also do Redux as well if I wanted to populate the GraphQL into the Redux as well. But if you fetch GraphQL, it's not as nice. And it's not as nice because there's some two tools that are out there. There's other tools that are not as well contributed to or used. So I kind of left those out. But has anybody ever heard of Relay or Apollo? Probably heard the names if you went to or listened to any of the React talks or React Conf talks. So Relay is out of Facebook. Apollo is out of the Meteor Group. And these are two client-based tools to actually get your GraphQL into your project. And I say client-based with an asterisk for Apollo because Apollo has a server version. I personally use Apollo, so I'm going to talk about Apollo. I had to delete a lot of Relay slides. I also haven't really used it as much, so I can't really speak about it as much. I built a project called OpenSauced. So it's an open source project to manage your open source projects. That's literally what it's for. I use it using the GitHub GraphQL API, which is, if you ever use the GitHub API, v4 is now GraphQL completely. And you can access it that way. So essentially, I added a repository to the project. I can make comments on the project, which is super nice. And I made this tool really to scratch an itch. I always wanted to do open source contributions, but I don't have relationships with all these other projects, so I've never used them. So what I do is that I created like a CRM tool so that I can manage like projects I'm interested in, because when you start a project, they get lost in all the other stars, and there's no real way to be like, I like this project, I want to contribute to it. So that's what this project is. It's open sourced, as I mentioned, but it's called open sourced. So if you have an idea, feel free to write an issue and I might look at it. No promises. But that's what this looks like. So you guys all familiar with React. It's a huge React component. It's a blob. And what's cool about Apollo is you can take advantage of higher order components. So once you do your GraphQL query, you just throw it on props. You guys are probably familiar with higher order components. If you're not, there's words on the screen that you can get more explanation. I learned higher order components through Redux. That was like my first intro. So React Redux. Once I learned to use Redux, it just made sense for why to use a higher order component. So check out Redux if you haven't. I don't know at this point. If you haven't used Redux, I want to hear your story of what you're using, because I'm really interested. Why are you dragging your feet? So I highlight on the bottom, that's where my query goes. If you look in the line below my query, I'm using a higher order component from the React Apollo library called GraphQL. Yeah, that's pretty much what it's called. And then I'm basically just doing what higher order components do. So everything that I get fetched from my GraphQL data, it's going to be in my props. So I can do this.props.all of our repositories, or this.props.data, and then within that data blob, I have all repositories, which then has each of the props I've actually identified, which is beautiful because I can actually maintain my application all on the front end. So I don't need to go back to my backend guys or my infrastructure guys and say, hey, this endpoint is not looking at what I need, or hey, you changed the name of, let's say, URL to like URL route. I can alias that as well, which I didn't talk about in these talks, but there's a lot of flexibility you get on the front end as a front end developer, or even if you're a full stack developer. Like I've noticed full stack development means you just do React and Redux nowadays, or maybe Express a little bit, but it's nice because you don't have to PR any sort of APIs or database or anything like that. You just use what you got and you describe what you got. So that shape of that data is what gets returned in my actual props. This slide just to point out that Relay has two different versions, which is part of the reason why I don't have it in this talk, because the versions kind of differ. But Relay Modern, Relay originally came out just to be a React specific thing. Relay Modern is now not just a React thing. Now you can use it wherever you want. All the React bindings were ripped out, and the API got improved a lot. So that came out. So there's a difference. So you might want to check your versions. I don't remember the version difference because I don't use Relay. Hopefully one day I will. So now the second question you probably have is like, oh, this is great. There's 6 people, maybe 5 people in the room that use GraphQL, not including the speaker. How do I use GraphQL in my app today? Like, this is great, but how am I going to get that? And what my goals were when I approached this hypothesis of getting GraphQL into my application was, one, I wanted to try out GraphQL at work. And second thing, I wanted to convince my team to use it. So at this point, I think I am the only one that has like a GraphQL use case in our company. You guys can fact check me if anybody on my team is actually listening. And the final thing is I wanted to do a React Native prototype. And what was really cool is that we were using React on the front end, that I could actually reuse all my components into my React Native app. The only problem was I had to use Redux. And our Redux has been around since Redux has been around. So there's some anti-patterns, there's some stuff that logic that's based on routers. And React Native, if you guys ever use it, the routers is kind of like, it's in a state of flux, pun intended. But so there's a lot of problems with that. There's also problems with anything that's HTTP specific. So if there's things like local storage that we were using in our Redux stores, I also couldn't port that over. And my project only had 2 screens. I had a site dashboard and I had a deploy screen. And I had to do a lot of manipulating Redux stores to make it work. I finally got to work, but then I was like, man, this is painful. I should just use GraphQL. And I did. So this is like a design mock. I do have the real version later, but I got my designer to make me mocks for a React Native app and what it would look like, or rather an iOS app. And it was nice. Sorry, I'm not real, my apologies. I forgot the segue for this slide. But anyway, GraphQL has SDL. I mentioned it earlier. It's a schema-defined language. So the language that we will see here on this slide is the SDL. And GraphQL schemas can live either on your database, sorry, not your database, your API level, or it can live in a gateway. So the Jamstack architecture that I showed you, I am literally just putting GraphQL right in the middle. And the reason I did this is because I originally started using GraphQL on our Rails app. So Netlify is built on a Rails API that's powered by Go microservices. It's also being powered by a Mongo database. Thanks, Matt, for the Mongo. But the problem with the Mongo database is like the real blocker, because the GraphQL Ruby gem that's available, so all these languages here support GraphQL as of 2 months ago when I first made this slide. All these languages support GraphQL. The GraphQL Ruby gem works out of the box, which is great. The only problem is the Mongo part. So the GraphQL Ruby gem is used heavily at GitHub, and they infer a lot of SQL. And since we're using Mongo, my choice would have been either fork the repository or create a PR to make it work with Mongo, which I'm pretty sure wouldn't get accepted, because I don't know a lot of people using Rails and Mongo together. If you are, let's talk. We're hiring, by the way. And so we had a Rails Go and a Mongo, and it made it super painful, and that was our API. And GraphQL and Ruby was SQL. So I couldn't use that. I also, I'm speaking over. So I had to come up with an idea. So I went to our backend guy and asked him, hey, I want this to work, but it's not working. You want to pair with me to do this? And he's like, no, I don't want to do this. Literally, that's what he said. And he's a funny guy. I just also want to point out, I'm missing an equal sign because it's Ruby, not JavaScript. But anyway, he recommended me doing this, which is actually taking our existing API and wrapping it into a node wrapper. At the time, he said just make our API gateway, speaking from his infrastructure tower and saying, hey, no, don't touch infrastructure, make a gateway. And I was like, okay. So I Googled this, and then I found out really quickly I could do this on our Rails app, but I would hand build everything because the gateway was built in Node. And as you remember, I'm not using Node on the back end. So I had to do something quite different. And it looks like this. So I'm actually using a tool called Launchpad. And I'm taking our API and pointing it to Launchpad and then sending that actual GraphQL endpoint to our client. And this was when Launchpad's only been out for maybe a handful of weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And this was a godsend for me because I was able to do what I was normally going to do on Lambda or something else or ECS and make a service to host my Node server to then send GraphQL. But since Launchpad's now out and it's free, I was able to just use this. And the beauty of this is that I didn't have to touch the infrastructure code. I was able to make this in less than a week. And I was able to prototype my React Native app really quickly. So all my barriers of entry that I had 2 slides ago, I no longer have because now I have Launchpad. So you could say I gave it a rest. And what I really did is I really gave it a rest because I just pointed my REST API to Launchpad, and then it sent GraphQL. And I know it's repeated myself, but I just want to hammer that point on, is that if a lot of people who are not using GraphQL, and maybe you want to do a side project, you will implement in your project, you can use this awesome tool called Launchpad and try it out worry-free or hassle-free. And they have, it's built on a CDN, actually it's built on Netlify, but you can actually add secrets to, so our secrets are hidden. So you can actually go to this incredibly long link there. Again, the slides are at disco.netlify.com. If you have a Netlify account, you can actually log in with your secret key. If you go to the dashboard, access, generate your key, and you can see all your data in GraphQL. Thanks to me. So highly recommend deploying a site right now if you don't have a site and going to Netlify and trying it out. And what's cool is I preface, and I know I had a real horrible segue for this STL thing, but all my STL stuff, all my type definitions are right here in Launchpad. The queries all happen right here, so it's basically a nice playground for me to test out my actual endpoint. And then my data, the JSON, looks like that. I can now take my JSON and put it right in my React Native app or my phone, and it's being powered by Launchpad. And that's what I have today. So going back to my horrible pun, but I was able to sample REST using GraphQL and Launchpad. So I was able to take disco and make it hip hop. So REST is really not dead. And I know the blog post only came out last week, but I think it kind of scratched me in the wrong way. REST is around. It's going to be around for a long time. I think GraphQL is only enhancing what REST is already doing. And until something better comes out than REST, I think we're going to be using it forever. I highly recommend if you want to use GraphQL, try out this way. I'm on Twitter, so check me out. And I just want to go over these goals again. Sorry, it sounded like I was kind of closing this out. I have way more slides. My bad. So my goals were this. I wanted to try out GraphQL. I wanted to get a React Native prototype out pretty quickly, and I think I did that. And I wanted to convince my team to use it. And the only reason this checkbox is not checked, it's because of this talk. Because I built the app, and then I had to also do the talk. So I wasn't able to actually go in the office and do a lunch and learn and tell everybody about it. So hopefully, and I'm also going on vacation starting Saturday for 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, I will share with the rest of the team, and that checkbox will be checked. Looking forward to that. And I just want to hammer this point again. This is the API. I call it an API gateway because that's what AWS calls it. I think that's kind of like a lot of people use AWS, so you can kind of wrap your brain around that. But the cool thing about Launchpad and the cool thing about this structure is that I can actually make this a node server. So if I just want to create a separate node server and host it wherever else I want to host it, point the REST API to it, point to React Native, React, Vue, whatever app you're looking to get GraphQL in, and you just point it. It also works with Ruby. I mean, you can host a Ruby server, get on Heroku or whatever, DigitalOcean, whatever you guys use for Ruby nowadays. And you can also create a Go service, a Go API. So it's almost endless. That GraphQL works with every single language. You can create a simple API and scratch whatever language itch you're trying to scratch and point it to whatever project you're trying to do. So you're probably thinking, man, isn't this the best, right? GraphQL is the future. It is the next big thing. And I can't honestly say that it's the best because I haven't done any performance metrics or I haven't really looked at it. I've looked at the response times and it's about the same. So about the same from my structure that I did in REST to what I did, or what I did in Redux to what I did in GraphQL. It's about the same. So I'm not really actually taking advantage of anything else GraphQL. Again, I did this like in a week and a couple days. So there's a couple other things that I don't have time to mention, but it's like batching queries. So imagine if you want to get all your users on your team, plus all their sites, plus all their deploys. That would be like 75 REST requests, right? So you get all that data. You could actually batch that into one REST request. So you can get all your data, and then you can cache it. So Apollo has some built-in caching as well. I'm not sure what Relay Story that is. Under the hood, Apollo actually works with Redux pretty well, too. So if you want to leverage Redux with Apollo, you can. It's built in. Speed, I have no idea. I wish I had time to actually look at metrics, but I was here enjoying talks. Performance, don't know yet. Hopefully I have a talk, or if you guys follow me on Twitter, I'll probably have a blog post about looking at this. I'll probably summarize everything about this into a blog in the future. And I have some honorable mentions that I couldn't really fit in the story of sampling data in Disco and stuff like that with Kanye West. So I'm just going to run through these. So GraphQL. GraphQL is like Firebase, but with GraphQL. Super awesome product, super awesome team. They also have some Lambda integrations as well, so if you want to do some fancy Lambda stuff. I won't explain that, but yeah, try out GraphQL. The color is green because it's really good for greenfield apps. So if you have a side project, or if you just want to try it out, there's a lot of really good tutorials that they put out there. GraphQL Up is a really cool tool. So I mentioned open source. Open source is built on GraphQL, and it uses GraphQL Up to take my existing schema of my repositories, users, and the SDL that I wrote out for my types. You can actually copy it using GraphQL Up. So if you go to the README of open source, I think I have a link. I have a link in a future slide. But if you go there, you can actually click GraphQL Up button, and it'll actually populate your GraphQL store, and then you can actually launch it on Netlify. So check that out if you're interested. I forgot I was supposed to talk during this GIF, but I'll skip that. GraphQL Server, I'd hinted Apollo has a server solution, and it's called GraphQL Server. You could actually, if you are using Node in the backend, you could actually use GraphQL Server instead of Express, because it actually uses Express as well. So keep that in mind. GraphQL Docs. So I mentioned that you can have all your documentation in line, so you don't have to go back to your documentation to figure it out. GraphQL Docs takes your GraphQL endpoints and all your SDL stuff and generates docs on the fly. So back in the old Node days, people used to use those big wall of comments to make sure you can generate your docs on the command line. I think Swagger does something similar to that. GraphQL Docs is very similar to that. So you have a docs page. Beautiful. This is actually put together by a local company called Scaffold. They're a GraphQL, just like GraphQL, they're GraphQL as a service platform as well. If you want to learn GraphQL and you want to learn from the beginning, there's a cool site that just came out a couple weeks ago called How to GraphQL. It's got GraphQL implementations for React, React Native, Vue, Angular 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know. It's got whatever the latest Angular. It's got that one, and it's got some other pretty straightforward ones as well. So howtographql.com, check that out. Apollo Optics. I added this to my actual React Native app, and I realized really quickly, getting analytics on your GraphQL queries is kind of useless when you're the only user. So I didn't really have much to show you. But as of last week, there's a lot of stuff happening in GraphQL in a short amount of time. As of last week, this became free for everybody up to 1 million requests. So 1 million queries, you get Apollo Optics for free. And you get to analyze what are your slow queries, what queries can actually be batched together. They give you like recommendations for that. It also, I haven't used that part of it yet, but you can also see what the SQL looks like. So if you're making a query to your database that happens to have either batching or you're nesting super deep, you can actually see what the SQL looks like from that, which is super awesome. So definitely check that out if you have a GraphQL project. And if you don't have a GraphQL project, you can go to bit.ly/opensourced, open source project for open source projects. Check it out, and you can clone that, spin it up, sign up for a GraphQL, and then you have a CRM tool for GraphQL, or for GitHub. I didn't have time to show this, but GraphQL is a tool that was also built. So it's like an Electron app, so you can see your GraphQL live. So very similar to Launchpad, but on the desktop. And if you see up in the upper right, which I'm not pointing to, is a little docs flag. All your documentation can be read directly in GraphQL. Very similar to GraphQL, or GraphQL, Scaffold. They all take the documentation, and you can look at it in line, which is super great. And then again, Launchpad, check that out. It's open sourced as well. It just got open sourced a couple weeks ago. So if there's anything you want to see in it, the Meteor group is actually really helpful, and they will be very responsive in Slack as well. And I also hinted at this as well. Apollo integrates really well with Redux. So if you don't want to get off the Redux train because you have too many reducers and stores, Apollo can actually just sit right next to your Redux actions and creators and use those as well. So imagine getting your entire batch queries of your users, repos, sites, and then you can put that right into your Redux store. So GraphQL is game-changing, and it's changing by the ability to sample. So imagine like designers that just want to see what data is out there for you. If you want to spec things, mock things in like Storybook or whatever you're using, you can use that. So, and I did mention GraphQL is changing the game. Disco.netlify.com for the slides. All the links are clickable, so if I talked way too fast for that, definitely check that out there. And I am bdougieyo on Twitter, so look out for a blog post about this shortly. Cool. Do we do questions here, or are we done? Cool. Tweet me questions. That's my Twitter.